Good morning, and welcome to Redeemer Lutheran Church. I'm Pastor Gary Lodeholt. So, why did they kill Jesus? As we make our way along our Lenten journey, as we draw closer to the celebration of Easter, we are all too painfully aware that the road to Easter passes through Good Friday. So often we don't really want to think about Jesus' death or dwell on it. But that's also a major part of what Lent is about. One of the things we think about during Lent is our sinfulness and our need for Jesus to die to save us. Still, something about the image of Jesus that we have and the fact that they killed Jesus just doesn't sit well together. Why would they want to kill Jesus, who taught so much about love and caring for your neighbor, and who did so many miracles of compassion and healing? Well, there is much that can be said about this. First, it was largely the religious leaders, the priests and Sadducees, who stirred up the crowds against Jesus. And perhaps one thing going on there was how Jesus challenged their pat assumptions about God. They were lording their position as leaders of their faith over the people and insisting that their view of God was the only view of God. Jesus challenged those assumptions. Another way to think about it is that Jesus acts in lots of ways like a mirror. When we stand next to Jesus, the person we see most clearly is ourselves. Standing next to Jesus, it is all too clear how we don't measure up in who we are supposed to be as children of God. Once you have that realization, you then have two options. You can change, which is hard, or you can break the mirror. With Jesus out of the way, you aren't forced to see the uncomfortable reality of how you don't measure up. So they broke the mirror, killing Jesus. There is, however, a third thing that we can't ignore as well. Jesus went about preaching, teaching, and healing, but at some point he set his face to go to Jerusalem, and he knew exactly what would happen when he got there. On several occasions he told his disciples in detail what he would face in Jerusalem, but even so he never wavered in his determination to go. And then, what is so intriguing is that when he got there, Jesus seemed to go out of his way to provoke those religious leaders to act as they did. It seems like Jesus was trying to stir up and instigate a conflict with them. Over and over, he tells not-so-veiled parables about them, or calls them out specifically, addressing things he knows will cause them a problem. It is as if Jesus is saying, I know what you are going to do, the secret you are harboring in your hearts. Let's get on with it. That's what we want to look at this week. The ways Jesus seems to provoke those religious leaders in the lead up to Good Friday. Jesus knew what they were planning, but he also knew what God was planning. The time was at hand. The first one we want to consider is actually a symbolic action that Jesus did. The prophets used to do these kinds of things using an object lesson, something like a children's sermon with a prop, to make a larger point. It also helps to remember here that Jesus usually had crowds around him, and some of the religious leaders would have seen what happened. So on Monday of Holy Week, Jesus was on his way into Jerusalem and he was hungry. He saw a fig tree that was in full leaf, and it looked healthy and green. He went over to it, but found that there were no figs on it, despite it seeming to be a healthy tree. So Jesus cursed the tree, and then they all headed into Jerusalem. When he got there, he overturned the tables of the money changers in the temple. Then the next morning, as they passed by on their way to Jerusalem again, they also passed by that fig tree again, and Peter noticed that it had withered. So what is really going on here? It seems so un-Jesus-like to curse a fig tree because he was hungry and it didn't have any figs. We aren't used to seeing Jesus do something so self-serving. In fact, it wasn't self-serving, but rather it was a symbolic action. You see, we are told that the fig tree is on the Mount of Olives, just across the Kidron Valley from Jerusalem. So, from the location of that fig tree, it was easy to look across the valley and see the temple full of religious leaders and people going in and out. So what Jesus was actually doing was drawing a comparison between the fig tree and the temple. The fig tree looked healthy, but was in fact producing no fruit. It was barren, good for nothing. Just so, Jesus is saying, that temple over there that looks good to the eye is also barren and not producing fruit for God. The temple and its leaders were spiritually empty. Perhaps you can see how challenging that would have been to those religious leaders. Jesus is telling them that they are trapped in old, outdated ways, and that in him God is doing a new thing. The center of it all was no longer in the temple, but in Jesus. But we need not get too smug about all this. How often are we ensconced in our traditions and patterns, drawing comfort in what we know and not open to the new thing that God might be doing among us? How often do we think we have God understood and think that God has to act like we expect? How often is our focus in worship on us and not on bearing fruit for God's kingdom? Sometimes Jesus' words provoking them also provoke us. May we be open to what God is doing. May our trees be full of figs. Thanks for watching, and remember to let this day belong to God.